Hey gang, welcome back. It's I, Dr. Bosky, and today I thought we'd talk about something a little different. And that something is after about 1,000 hours in Shmup Creator and working on the Dr. Bosky shoot 'em up, what have we learned? Just some pro tips maybe with the engine and our own design and development process. I've seen there were a few requests asking about what have we learned? I think they're really good questions, and a few other folks have jumped in to talk about this. So I thought I would also read through some of those comments and feedback as well. So why don't we jump over to it? Yeah, all right. So from a high level, basically start small and focused. I think the first tutorial you can run into in the Shmup Creator community is just your first level, how to just get it all together, to have beginning, middle, end, how to do some iteration on enemies. It's a fantastic tutorial. It's a good place to start. I'd also say, this sounds silly, but the tool is so easy to use. It's important to also realize that while you can jump in and do a lot, you really want to try to start with small and focused goals that you can deliver on. So for instance, right, like if you haven't done any explosions, it's probably a good idea to go into the explosion editor and start to learn and play with the explosions a little bit. You have to kind of, when you're a single indie developer, you generally have to, you got to choose your battles, but everything that you don't know that you put off means that by the time you get to it to start figuring it out, you may have made mistakes in the way that you built your assets, the way you put together your enemies, the way you're doing level logic, and those compound over time. So a lot of times development is often throwing away a chunk of what you did to redo it, to improve it, or to fix issues you didn't know exist. So go through the manual, determine what type of enemies you want, what kind of level setup you're going to have. Is it going to be a horizontal shmup? Is it going to be a vertical shmup? Is it a 16:9 aspect ratio? So these are all good questions. Go through and lay out all your questions, and then ask yourself, after you've done the reading, you check with the community, what's the best way to approach those? So, and I think small and focused projects that you can complete definitely can help you build upon your successes. I think it would have, had I gone back in time, I think at this point now, given where I'm at with the project, is about 6 months in, aside from the art side of this, that I may have benefited by releasing my levels one at a time. And because they're at about 15 minutes, they're good like small jump in, get a high score, understand that would have helped me better understand and start fleshing out and to iterate on things like the core mechanics and the multiplier system, the high score system, all that good stuff. Another thing that I highly recommend is, if you decide you want to change your shmup, don't change your shmup into a different project. So to give you an example, here is where we start at yonder time. So we started with wanting to make basically this Eintroin, it's like Einhander meets Metroid, and very much in that kind of that style of thing. So here you had basically, you fly through the world. I had an entirely different way that I laid out my world. I had a different way for doing the image and navigation, and I learned some really important things by going through this, right? So one, I learned that in Shmup Creator, if you want to have collision between your player sprite and the environment, you can do it in that, how do I say this? So where you have two pieces of collision that come together to create a corner, you can take your ship collision and you can shoot through that collision. So the engine wasn't really designed with player or a ship collision in mind. Yes, you can collide against sprites, you can do damage, but you have to realize that it's a bit finicky, and meaning that you'll find cases where you get out of the world. And then once you're out of the world, what do? You can put volumes out there which automatically kill the player, but one of the limitations we currently have, it's going to be fixed pretty soon, is you don't have the ability to set where you respawn to, so you can't create safe spots. So I learned a ton, and I love doing this and working through this process. But in learning that, because it was also a large project, understanding what your limitations are and how to design around them will help you. At the end of the day, you're trying to, your main goal is to release your shmup, ideally, or you're doing it as a hobby, whatever your thing is, right? But typically, we're making games for other people to play them. So, so then you want to hedge your bets. So that's some things I learned there about that. This was a super fun project. parts of this actually wound up finding its way. Like, you know, I have a version of this boss that I prototyped in this really tiny small space. Man, it's kind of funny to look at this kind of going back. So some other things I learned from this, right, is so I took this project and I came to a realization where we don't have a save system. It's totally fine. Just we don't have one right now. So if you want someone to spend 30 minutes playing a level, or 40 minutes, or an hour, or 2 hours, whatever your playthrough time is, because these are much bigger, because it's the nature of wanting to have an adventure shmup where you basically explore the world, of course, right? You fly through the world, you check things out, and that means that as time goes on, then and if you're not going to give like infinite lives, then the risk of losing everything, your progress basically, is it becomes more and more exponential, right? To the point where then most people aren't going to want to play your game at that point, because it's not a modernized style game, right? So learning these things, super important. And I think the engine can get there at some point too. So save system was one thing. Collision needs some work. We actually turned off, as in the royal we, turned off AI-driven enemies. So they may come back, but these are like, there's often requests for enemies that follow the player and things like that. So there's some prototype work. We had a version in the engine, but they created a lot of bugs. And frankly, you know, Sunny's priority is trying to work on the features that give everyone the most bang for their buck. So there were some other things also with the follow cam. So one of the things I really wanted to achieve here was I wanted to achieve the ability for, as you move through the world, that the camera starts to move ahead. And if you flip, because we have flipping in this case, then the camera then goes back the other way. So you're always getting like a look ahead functionality. But you know, we're working on it. So we learned a ton. But here's the thing, right, is the way I set up my levels here, the way I set up my camera, so the distance from the camera to the world plane, because it's a 3D engine. I inherited all those when I switched to a horizontal shmup. And as a result, I unintentionally picked up other things that I just wasn't as familiar with the engine at that point, that had I been able to go back, I would have changed, right? So, and another good example of that is, right now in the engine, you have, so it's really fantastic sprite scaling. So you have, and we've talked about that in another video, but for instance, when you, like for me, we're working with high resolution art. So when we scale it, for the most part, there aren't many artifacts because it's nice high resolution art anyways. And then that comes to the next question, right? So in our particular art setup, we're not working with really small images and then scaling them up. So had I gone back in time, I would have started a clean project and I would have changed my scaling resolution in the engine to 1. So it would be 1:1 for my graphics, as opposed to what we have now. It's great the way it is now, but if I were to change that now, I already looked at it in my current game setting, it would create so many tack-on effects and things I'd have to fix, because I've built so much gameplay around the current distance the camera has, and also the size of the sprites. So that leads me to our other bits, right? So don't migrate projects to different projects. Start fresh. You can bring your assets over, but you know, like, or strip it all the way down to its bare bones, and then make sure that's what you want to start with. Because the longer you go, here I am, you know, hundreds of hours later, the longer you go in development, the more you have to retrofit based on previous development and assumptions, right? So as well, we get more knowledgeable. That's kind of the side of that. So another item here was define your style and art process early, right? So I wasn't sure I wanted to commit art resources. I'm not a great artist myself, and so as a result, I took the approach of tech arting a bunch of sprite sheets from games that I love, like Castlevania Symphony of the Night. There's Dodonpachi. There's a bunch of stuff in there, right? So because I really want to have basically spaceship fighting demons, monsters, like, you know, that's what the game is becoming, right? So, but before I was, you know, there are a lot of engines are out there. There's a lot of software. for indie developers, and as a result, there's a lot of abandonware, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to commit. So in that process, that meant that I was putting things into the engine at non-square Power 2 resolution, non-square sprites. I was scaling the sprites just with the engine scaling, which is fine, but that meant I would take a really small image and then I would scale it up to make it fit. And then when I came back to replace that image, that monster, with a proper higher resolution 1:1 pixel aspect ratio in the engine, then what would happen is that I had all the gameplay that I built with the scaling of that previous enemy, and then when I put the new enemy size in that was higher resolution, that then would be giant because it still has the previous scale, and as a result, then I would change the scale back to 100%, but then that would change my weapons because weapons are based on enemy scaling, right? So so that would then mean I'd have to go back and change the projectiles, and you can configure and tweak lots of this good stuff. These aren't major complaints, it's just stuff I've learned, right? But I'd then have to go back, change the type of bullets, change the bullet resolution, and then I would have to then also in some cases, because the way that I'd set my bullet patterns up, that meant that the bullets, because the size changed a little bit, that then I'd have to then like tweak and tune bullet patterns, and became like in some cases I had to replace entire bosses where it took almost as much time to replace those bosses as I built them originally. And then when you're starting to do playtesting, you start to make less and less risky changes because you're building your game to be accessible. And typically as developers, we wind up building stuff way too hard because you're going to play it for so many more hours than anyone else ever will, really, realistically. So it's very easy to be like, oh, this is great for me, but then it turns out it's just a bunch of face punching for everyone else, right? So, and it's a kind of a house of cards in that respect. So define your art style and your art process early. What size enemies, and I for me, in the engine, hey, hey, all right, in the engine, I wound up basically having, I basically put in dummy enemy types, right? And I just basically, and I encourage people to do this as well. So, I just a basic white texture with the type of resolution that it's at, right? And then basically this is your full resolution for me. And I have my fudge value of scale of 1 in the engine itself. But the thing is you don't need anything like, if you're gonna make a giant screen filling boss, it might be perfectly fine to say, okay, like it's going to be a 512 by 512. If you're going to do animation frames as sprite sheets, then you're already now talking about to have 4 frames animation. It's 1024 by 1024. So, and it's like you really don't want to go over 4K resolution textures. And in the engine, just a good guidance from Sunny. But the key here, right, is just what do you need if you have small enemies, and it's also in relationship to the playership, right? Do they need to be bigger than 64 by 64, or do they need to be 128 by 128? And so my rule of thumb in terms of the way that we do art now is we're future proofing by doing the art 1 resolution higher, always in power of 2. And then scaling that down in the image and then putting that into the engine. So that way we kind of have, if I ever want to go back and do higher resolution graphics, I already have one set of images that are higher than the set that I'm using now. So another little pro tip, right? Work in a higher resolution, scale it down, but you don't want to work in like 512 by 512 and scale down to 64 by 64. You're going to lose so many pixels at that point. And so it's like, oh, well, if it's a 128 by 128 enemy, a lot of our enemies are then in 256 by 256, right? We know we got these big bosses, right? These big bosses, they're not 512, so we work in 1024 by 1024, etc. So that was a good learning for me. And what else we got here? Define your file naming convention and stick to it. Yeah. So luckily for me, I mostly had some good discipline, but sometimes when you're in the thick of it and you're basically just cracking through and trying to really just get your focus, get your push to like getting a first version of what you have in your brain out. Sometimes you just have a lot of wreckage, right? And that wreckage comes in the form of when you take shortcuts to not create new assets, or you reuse other assets, or you borrow a bunch of assets from that came from the Shmup Creator packs, right? From the prototype games, right? The example games. And what can happen at the end of that is, when you have to come back to fix something, you want to be able to see what's on screen and understand what your naming convention is for finding that asset, right? So a good example of this is, when, and I can already show where I've broken my own rule a few times. So when I go into my player sets, right? So when I go into my player weapon sets, so I have a naming convention that I use here. So it's P for player _, T for top weapon _ and then the name of the weapon. And then I know that at least when I talk about weapons, I can always go into my data structure for looking at these weapons, and they all logically group to these different assignments, right? Now, I've also learned as I've been still prototyping, that when you rename your assets, so if you change all the names of your assets and then they don't match the textures or the bullet pattern or things like that, then it's harder to find the links and then go figure out what you need to change. I hope that makes sense. So another good example of this is if I pop over to my game directory. So here's the thing, right? So I have in Bulu Studios, I have under games, there's a DBK project. So everything in the DBK project, right, is essentially assets, models, enemies, sprites. So, and we all know this, right? This is where the engine picks up all of the enemy sprites to basically render, right? So you don't want to always just make live edits to your game directory, because what if you make a mistake, right? You can back up, there's that's another thing. Always make sure you have a process for backing up your assets, whether you're doing hard copies of your directory. Myself, I use Perforce. I have a video on that somewhere as well. But it's just always a good practice, right? Save often, make backups regularly, because you may, especially with Shmup Creator, you only get one undo. So whenever you save, like, you better make sure that you're not saving a bunch of bad work or work where you're accidentally changing a bunch of things that you didn't realize you changed. We've all been there. And then you lose, like for instance, it's sometimes easy to add a bunch of scale values to objects in the engine and then have their relative changes relative to each other. Then they actually scale out differently than you expect, and then they wind up being in different places in the world than you intended. If you save that and you want to go back and undo it, you only have one undo, and chances are you've done something else at that point. So now you have a bunch of work to go back and reposition all your assets. No one wants to be there. So, also another little small thing that I did here too, right, is when I started, I was under the impression, so you can see here, like the Trent Demon right arm, that I would add the resolution for each of the assets. And it turns out at the end of it, which I like seeing these because it's easier for me to understand just at a glance, but I didn't factor in, for instance, the sprite sheets, right? So right here, you can see the Trent Demon arm, right? So the sprite sheet is a 1024 by 512. When I initially listed it, I listed it as 128 by 256. So target resolutions in mind, I really want to have it much taller. These things are almost screen filling. And so I had a 256 there. But now when I look at the image individually, even though I know it's a sprite sheet, I have to do the math in my head to then know or just open it up and look at the dimension of the sprite sheet. So understand your naming conventions, try to stick to them when you're making changes, or when you do that final cleanup, make sure that you go back and clean up your assets, because it's going to save you a lot of time in the end. All right, so that was data structure. What else we got? Yes. So we talked about this a little briefly, right? So set your camera distance, FOV, and determine your target resolutions and engine sprite scaling early. So I'll just give you a good example of this, right? So, so if I go into preferences, no, it's not here, is it? It is level properties. No, not here as well. The camera? Ah, okay, here's a good example, right? So here's the camera. My camera, because I inherited it from Adventure Shmup that I was working on, the field of view is something now if I want to change it to be tighter, and then what's going to happen is that you can see already that where the camera is looking and the size of the of my ship, it's all make sure I don't save, but it's all it creates unintended changes. So you really want to you want to get in your test assets, get in your test grid, make sure that one of the most important things, right, is control, and then it's camera setup. So player control it is, and camera setup, and then probably next up is environment scale, and then after that it's probably enemy scale, right? So if you kind of tackle these things in terms of dialing in what the feel you want. If you do these up front, as opposed to coming back and trying to do them after you've already built a level or built, several hours of content, it's going to save you a lot of time in the end. So that was what that is. I'm gonna make sure I don't save this. Oh crap, saved it. That's all right, I can fix that. Don't do what I just did. Well, All right, while we wait for that. Okay, so this is also another small thing that I've just learned over time that's super important to know. Let me go back and fix this real quick. Camera. I believe it was 70. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that looks about right. All right, cool. I'll double check that number here in just a bit. Okay, but all right, here's the other thing, right? So what I highly recommend is build sandbox experiences while you prototype things, right? So my camera, just a little trick that I use. I sometimes just have a camera object that I just check and uncheck modify speeds on. So then sometimes, you're working on logic, or you're working on experiments or whatever it may be, and you want to have a safe place to do it. So if you do it in a prototype level, where you're always doing your new stuff there and then backporting that over to your new levels, that's one way of doing it. But I guess the takeaway here, right, is you don't want to get too dogmatic about that. But the takeaway is that try not to do your experimentation in production content, right? Because you always have a chance. Like the other day, I was helping someone with answering a question about snake enemies, right? And snake enemy types, and then it was about the ordering between background and foreground elements in the snake ordering, and I accidentally used one of my own snake object types, which was one I'd already shipped, where I'm like, oh, I think this is done. I changed the amount of segments because I was experimenting, and then I forgot about that. And when I went back to play the levels I had in production, because those are global values, then I had accidentally changed all of those values there. So just be cognizant of when you're experimenting with live content, production content versus experimental content as well. So one other little pro tip here that I've kind of done from my side that's maybe you guys might want to take on. So this is my latest challenge level. So the thing is, and I've talked about this before, but this is a little bonus tip, right? So everything I've, for the most part, developed, except for my big bosses, where you can see my mechs here, they're in the level, and because a lot of times I have custom logic, right? Like for instance, I have these lost soul wisps, which then have these bits of logic, and if I were to bring this enemy type basically into the world as a new enemy type, the soul wisp, I'd have to rehook up all this logic, right? And really what I want, because I'm using varieties of enemies and challenge remix levels, I'm using enemies I've already dialed and tuned. So I don't want to redo that dialing and tuning. So whenever I go to make a new level, when I complete one, I basically take all of the enemies that I kind of have them out here in this kind of sandbox area. And then if I ever want new ones, I just shift drag and click, and then I bring the enemy along with all of the logic into the place where I want it to be in the world, right? So and you can see as my levels have evolved, because I add new enemies, this gives me an opportunity to have basically a bigger toy box, right? Because you can copy entire levels, but you can't copy things between levels. So good example of this is I also have, this is my pacifist mode logic. And to wire all this up from scratch each time is a big pain in the butt. Probably, it's about, this is probably 15 minutes, maybe 20, and along with testing. But, like, you have to remember how you did it, and, you have to configure everything. It's not hard, but it's time consuming. So for me, I use the cheat of copying my levels from level to level. And when I'm working on stuff, I create little sandbox areas within the level and make sure that I use prototype assets as opposed to production assets. Okay, that was a lot. So what else we got? All right. Yep. Set your core features contained in a single master level as much as possible. Yep. So those are these two. We talked about that. So the other one here, right? This will save you some time. So basically, when you're developing enemies, like you want to make sure you should probably, I recommend this. Take one enemy and then do everything for it. So the spawning of the enemy, the particle effects for the enemy, the death state for the enemy, the weapon for the enemy, of course, if it's got different weapon types, the variants for it, and then also its death states, right? So once you've done one all the way through, that's going to help you understand what it's going to take to do that. But also, that's going to inform some of your design process, because it's easy to make the mistake and say with organic enemies, there's a reason why when you look at other shmups, right? Like a lot of times shmups only have a few different types of explosions and they're generic and they're across all the enemies, because it's very time consuming to make custom death animations and death explosions, right? They're gratifying, but you want to finish your game at some point. So it's important to know what it's going to take for you to set that up. And also it'll help inform what kind of art you need to do, how to wire it up. And then, to give you a better estimate on what you're looking for when you do your new designs, right? So, and it's just important to do those. You try to do one thing and then do it all the way to the end. If you do a boss battle, do your entire boss battle until you've tuned it and tweaked it, and then it gives you a sense for that type of boss battle you can do, and that'll help inform how you're going to do art, animation, weapons, destruction for that boss encounter later on. All right, let's see how. So here's something I wish I would have. This is kind of a mixed bag here, right? So one of the things that's really great in Shmup Creator is that we have, if I go to like enemies, for instance, right? I mean, check this out. Everyone's seen these enemies, right? These are cool. Right out of the box, you get a lot of good stuff, right? And I think that's great. And I made the mistake of using these as my early building blocks and then building additional content around it. And so now I'm slowly trying to remove these dependencies and these assets. And frankly, at the end of the day, it would have been better for me to do the prototype project, start with a clean project, and then start to build up even if I were going to borrow art assets or use them or explosions. I know it's tough when you have a completely blank project. But what's happened for me, right, is, a good example here is there are things that you inherit. It's actually probably even better to see it with enemy weapons, right? Like there are things that I've inherited from the sample projects that I've included that now I'm slowly phasing out, but it creates other issues where I have some content I'm looking at I don't need anymore. I don't need I don't need to rely anymore on these prototype enemies, because I've realized how they're all put together, right? So same thing with enemy weapons and things like that. Like those samples are great. They're useful. I've seen we've all used them, which is great. It's awesome. Look, some of the explosion effects that come with Shmup Creator are fantastic. They're really hard to make on your own, or even to go and buy and source. So like it's very tempting to use the assets that come with it, but just realize that over time, it's going to take more time to phase those out of your project properly. All right. What else we got? All right. Yep. So I talked about resolution tags for my art assets. Yeah, so, the other one, this is general wisdom, right? So know the engine limitations and design for them, right? So this takes time. You don't know what you don't know until you've learned it, right? Like, that's just the way it goes. And we touched on these things a little bit here too, right? So there's no save system, there's no persistence, right? Collision between the player and other objects in the world is rough, aside from taking damage. But if you're going to use a follow camera, right, like, it's a different type of collision. What else? There's some limitations with how many music tracks you can have at one time, how you can crossfade music and audio effects, right? There's things like that. What else do we have? So I guess the main thing is when you imagine the type of game that you want to build, and Shmup Creator is crazy powerful. I love it. I'm not going to be done with this thing for a long time. And I'm really honored and privileged to just be part of the journey, right? Sonny's been working on this thing for a very long time. I think I found the other day, I bumped into it on a forum. He's been working on it as early as 2014. 2014. And that's a hell of a passion project to keep going, and he's still very active in making and developing. So anyways, I digress. But the thing is that it's a small development team. So if you're going to build your project, and you build your project like I did, you're like, oh, like, you want to build an adventure shmup. How big will this be, right? And then you discover, oh, there's limitations that maybe we could fix at some point, but that's only for me and my style of game. And that's not necessarily what the community needs, right? So it's important to know what the engine can and can't do, what might be available at some point in the future, but I wouldn't develop your projects waiting on features. You may get them and you may have use cases, but like, it's small teams. We all have day jobs, right? Like, no one's getting rich off this by any measure. It's all just passion projects, so that also means that there's only so much development effort to go around, right? And it's important to be aware of that. If you really want to script specific or specialized logic, and you're more of a coder and you want to work in C# in a more of a Unity style framework, or Unity 3D engine, then this may not be the project for you, right? So, but look, the price point's great. The ability to rapidly iterate and develop gameplay is fantastic, and the tool is a fantastic, cool tool. But important to know the limitations. So read the docs, think about your own explorations, do your experiments, and then as you gain confidence, design with those constraints in mind, because that gives you the most possibility of finishing your project. Starting is easy. Finishing is hard. Getting to that 90% in development is, in some ways, it's hard to get there, but it's not as hard as finishing that last 10%. The last 10% is how you bring it all together. It's how you finish all the polish. It's how you get it released. And it's everything that comes with supporting your development process, right? So, all right. I think that was it. So let me see here. A couple honorable mentions. Because this came up here, I think. Yeah. So Reflex, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's double check. So yeah. So Angel had commented the video was incredibly useful. We did a video on video recording tools to enhance your game development processes, and then I talked about some game development bits there as well. Angel has said that he's going to completely do how he's done his level setup based on what I've learned. Good thing I was early in making my level. I'm hardly losing any progress. Ooh, I guess that's a good point too, right? So I touched on this about how you copy levels. So here's the thing, right? Is I just recently rolled out these features, basically pacifist mode, right? And as I described this, I'm probably being generous. It's probably about a half hour to implement this. So I have 6 levels in my game, and technically 5 because I didn't want to put this in the boss level, the big giant boss level. But not only did I implement this once, it's like, oh, my core feature set, right? Like, because I can't copy between levels, I had to implement this 5 times over, right? So you can already 5 times 30 minutes, right? You can already see how much time it took. And then that was only the first version. Then I play tested it, and then I realized from playtesting, rightly so, that it wasn't as a rewarding feature as it needed to be. This is game development, right? And what did that mean? That meant that I had to update the logic in the process and then I had to do it 5 times again. Yeah, and it wasn't quite 30 minutes but still. So all said and done, it's probably a day to implement this feature across all my levels. So the more that you have all of your core features prototyped and developed within a single level before you scale up to do the other things, right? The easier it'll be for you, because you really want to have your core gameplay really solid. Otherwise, every time if you have 5 levels in your game, every time you want to make a change, a sweeping change across the game that isn't a generalized global thing like changing player health or any player damage or enemy health, but if it's level scripting logic, then you're gonna have to re-implement that every time and fix that bug in every place. So try your very best to make your core level, your core experience, a fully complete experience, and you use that as your constraint. You're gonna have lots of ideas. I'll do a video on this, but you're gonna have lots of ideas about, I could do this feature, I could do this enemy, I could do this thing. Oh, this would be great, right? And if you continue to do that and always do the new stuff, it's going to be much harder to support and maintain and develop those features across every instance of your level. So in some cases, you have to, define what your core game experience is, lock it down to that, decide how many levels you want to do from that, and then stay focused on primarily not doing a lot of creative bits. When it comes to enemy behaviors and patterns and bosses, yes, you have more creativity there, but it's better to, in my opinion, to try to get your core base and then deliver on that across your levels, and then try not to get into this refactor mode where you're having to make those changes now across all your levels. And especially if you have a brand new cool idea that you want to implement, like I'm doing in the case of some of these bigger features, then I recommend that do your best to realize those as part of your first vision, because it's going to save you a lot of time at the end. All right, so let's see. Alec had said, I must admit that if I built another game, I won't use the same structure or the same means I used for nanophores. Yeah, see, we've all learned these hard tricks as well. Siphon, that was a question. Reflex says, for my next game, I'll be changing setup process. Oh yeah, this is where this whole video came from, right? So, because I had said, it's the old adage from construction that I like: measure twice, cut once, right? To keep you from making false cuts and wasting and having to redo work. And then Reflex says, hey, you guys have invested a huge amount of time into the engine and game design, so it would be incredibly interesting to hear what you do differently next time. What problems or issues would you change or fix about how you set up your games with the engine? It would be great to hear your advice on what you've learned, as you both have a massive amount of time spent within the engine and have gained a lot of deep knowledge. Yeah, so here we are. I'm doing this for you, Reflex. Luggage says that he wants to do an adventure style game that I was trying. He says he thinks it's possible. Another limitation with that, I was trying to find my old post on this, but there's also some wonkiness when you have a big world with how long enemies can stay alive, and whether or not they respawn based on when you come back to that area, or if they just get paused while they're out of off screen for a long period of time. So there are a few other things that I bumped into. So, but it's just testing those things, right? Tarka says, I would do things completely different on the workflow side of things. Names of sprites, sounds, music would all have prefixes to the names, so I know which level they match into. Yep, very important. Choose smaller sprites for enemies and larger background pieces. Would also go for a bullet hell style next time. Horizontal style would do each enemy's bullet sprite, particles, and sound effects as I go for each one, rather than throw in an enemy and come back to it later. Yeah, so we learned the hard way around those as well. So, all right. Was there anything else? That was pretty cool. Let me see here. Experiments. Yep. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, make sure we're back here. Oh, look, we have credits. They're not our credits though. All right. So, again, the community is fantastic. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the support and sharing. We're all on this cool journey together. It's very humbling. We're all learning. And so, I'm here, and it's an honor to just share the things I've learned and to see how far we've come, since we started this whole thing. We're just over half a year at this point. And, I think we're starting to turn that corner where it's a big project. It's a little bigger than than I expected it to be, and I have multiple projects in the back of my brain that I want to start. And so now I'm really starting to personally focus on achieving my first alpha build, getting to release, and what that looks like, and just really trucking through that. And then now, as I have new ideas, for the most part, I'm shelving them for the next version, the next game, the next whatever I wind up doing. Because if you constantly trundle through doing the new stuff, and that's some of the most exciting bits, to imagine something and then go from imagination to seeing a reality version of that. Oh, it's amazing. But if you continually do that, you're also just creating more work for yourself that you have to come back and then really polish up to ship, right? So, and it's hard to see when you're in that moment how much work you're creating for yourself, because primarily, unless you're working with other folks, which I highly recommend if you can, but you're like, for instance, for my artist, right? Like, he's fantastic, he's amazing, and we work probably on art about 30 hours a week, and we finish basic enemies. We finish maybe 2 or 3 basic enemies every 2 to 3 weeks, right? So if you think about it, and I just did a look at my accounting, right, where in the engine, and this is technically also counts pieces for enemies, so not just straight up enemies, but we have over 74 enemy types in the game right now, like, and they're not all individual enemies, but that's all art that needs to be updated and tech art it back into the engine and accounted for. So you just be aware that your eyes are always going to be bigger than your stomach in terms of imagination. And one of the most important things that gives you confidence is to work through the process and complete the project, because as you become more versed in understanding, when you go from imagination to implementation to then debugging, tuning, polishing, and shipping, it's a whole other level. Oh, which reminds me, I guess a bit of a pro tip. So fundamentally, while we have the ability to have level choices and things like that from the latest round of work that Sonny's put into the engine, which is great, the engine was built with an arcade game in mind. So bigger, longer levels aren't, they can be done, but shorter, smaller levels, high score entry, more complex scoring, right? Like it's Shmup Creator is designed to be able to build lots of different style shmups. So, and the further out you go in your imagination from understanding what the core types of shmups are, the more likely it will be that you find things that the engine can't do yet. And it's only that's the main thing, can't do yet, right? But those become your limitations. So being aware of that and designing around that, as we're all learning, I think is a big part of the journey. All right, if you found this valuable, please leave any comments or questions in the below. Thank you everyone that's been following along, and we'll catch up to you next time. Bye.